reframes these outcomes of design practice as these relational entities rather than as solitary design artifacts and outcomes. And these are what's known as design things. Co-design opposes designers as this heroic, centralized figure in design processes, and it's also critical of these presumptions around who or what participates when designing. Co-design also resists the Western tendency to ascribe agency to individual people. So instead, it recognizes that objects and technology are these equally active and agental participants. And lastly, co-design alters the focus from end users in, say, a traditional human-centered design sense, but actually challenges how to design for publics and these broader issues of concern together. So the last part of my research framework is critical making. It was first conceptualized by Matt Ratto in the late 2000s, and it's a participatory workshop method uniting two disconnected modes of engagement. The first mode, critical thinking, often considered to be abstract, explicit, theoretical, internal, and individualistic, and making, a mode that's thought of as material, hands-on, embodied, and external. Critical making is typically a process-oriented activity with design artifacts only serving as evidence of the critical making activity. And overall, critical making supports my exploration of these abstract actor network theory concepts in a more approachable way, blending scholarly concepts with these hands-on making activities and discussion. And my interest with critical making aligns with another key critical maker, Garnet Hertz, who sees it as useful in reintroducing a sense of criticality back into post-2010 maker culture to unsanitize, unsmooth, and repoliticize it. And so finally, I'll discuss my practice-based research, which is the biorecycling machine. And this is a speculative interpretation of the petrochemicals industry's reduce, reuse, recycle campaign introduced in the 1970s. So to reevaluate 3D printing and its use of PLA, the biorecycling machine centers around this idea of PLA's biocompatibility with the human body. As PLA is biocompatible, it means it can safely reside inside our body for extended periods of time, while slowly being absorbed and eventually excreted. So interestingly, actually, PLA is used extensively in drug delivery systems, short and long-term implants, load-bearing screws, sutures, these kinds of things. And so building on this, the biorecycling machine uses a handheld injector resembling a rotary tattoo machine to deliver this finely granulated PLA into the skin. When it enters the body, the process of hydrolysis begins. The polylactic acid molecules in the ink are chemically broken down by processes in the body into carbon dioxide, lactic acid, and water. And then after about 30 weeks, the body will have completely recycled these PLA particles and excreted them through urination or respiration. So as a critical making project, critically engage makers with sustainability and biodegradability of the PLA material they frequently use through this invasive quality of a tattoo. So the biorecycling machine promotes makers and designers to reconsider the assumptions and ideas around sustainability that are embedded in 3D printing technology. So for example, how this device might tell us, what it might tell us about problems surrounding 3D printing, bioplastics, and waste recoveries, and why would it even be necessary? Or how it might shape our current understanding of 3D printing practices to avoid a world where human bodies are actually used to recycle plastics. If we're responsible for recycling this 3D printed waste inside our body, can it encourage the reconsideration of things like the value of 3D printed objects, the speed at which they're produced, or the networks that are involved to try to recover these materials after we've discarded them? So through actor network theory and co-design, the biorecycling machine works to deprivilege the body of human makers as this individual and separate thing from broader networks of more than humans in nature. It highlights how human bodies and the waste we produce are biologically and chemically connected with these external processes in nature through the idea of networks. So just to conclude, this talk reported on my analysis of actor network theory, co-design, and critical making through the biorecycling machine. I discussed the theoretical sustainability of 3D printer filament PLA and how it often ends up in landfill due to these gaps of design and recycling networks. Through actor network theory, I illustrated how networks of design and maker practice can be expanded to acknowledge the importance of more than humans in these networks of making, 3D printing, and waste recovery. And I've also shown how co-design supports the understanding of my practice-based research as a kind of relational design thing. As a critical making project, the biorecycling machine can be interrogated. The sustainability of PLA can be interrogated as this matter of fact. And then PLA sustainability when it's considered as a matter of concern, the broader interrelationships between humans and more than humans that comprise it as a matter of concern can make this issue more readily open to question and challenge. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Matthew, for your great presentation. Can everyone hear me okay? I hope so. I'm just going to go over to some questions now whilst we have Matthew here. Does anyone have any questions they would like to ask Matthew? Otherwise, I can begin. Matthew, are you okay with having some questions now?
Yeah, by all means. Thank you.
Great. Wonderful presentation. Really interesting approach to see the use of Latour's actor network theory applied and co-design applied to something like 3D printing, as well as all of the different ways that you've usurped the traditional design processes. So it was really fascinating research. My question is around possible scope for this research, which might not be something that you're thinking about at the moment, because I realise you're currently doing a PhD, yeah. So I wonder, like, have you applied any of this research within education contexts? Have you done any of these critical making, almost workshops with students? Could you chat to that and the potential scope of this? I think there's just so much potential in this research. So, yeah.
Oh, definitely. Well, thank you for that question. I have actually done a couple critical making workshops, and I can cram it all into this presentation in the 15 minutes. But yeah, I have reached out with people who, you know, they don't consider themselves as makers, or they just kind of want to get in on these hands-on activities. And you know, yeah, it's actually been very fruitful just hearing about their subjective experiences using this. So I think this idea of critical making, I haven't used it specifically in like an education context, but I think it could definitely be applied to that. And there's a lot of research within the maker movement about making being used as a way to get people interested in STEM fields or STEAM. So yeah, I mean, I think there would definitely be some crossover, and you could definitely apply to that.
And have you found that, like, by applying the, and please jump in if there are other more questions, otherwise I will just ask one more or just elaborate this more, with the use of applying, like adding that actor network theory, I think, to a co-design process is a very rich, a way to really invigorate and add much more kind of nuances to co-design and participatory practice. So I am really interested in how this work is kind of presenting its own network. And here is a question from Kit. Thank you, Kit. This is for you, Matthew. The makers movement is such a powerful force outside the academy. Do you see new opportunities for higher education through a more porous approach to collaborative education? And has COVID-19 impacted the maker movement for better or for worse? Over to you.
I think I'll answer the second part of that question first. So has COVID impacted the maker movement for better or for worse? In maker movement circles, the talk is that humans, we are just so great at designing and solving and fixing problems. We can solve any problem. So there is, you know, if you go to the maker movement, if you go to Make Magazine's website right now, it'll say how makers are contributing to solving the COVID crisis. And there's all this, you know, huge outpouring of people with 3D printers making those straps to go around the head for face masks to fit more comfortably, or face shields and all these kinds of things. But again, like this problem with PLA is the kind of more nuanced, or the more of the stuff you can uncover through this actor network analysis kind of gets glossed over. So for example, the problems with amateurs making, you know, life-saving medical equipment, and, you know, who's responsible if that equipment fails, or you know, this you know, amateur ventilators, I think, was a huge one. It was all these people kind of co-designing, collaborating, and doing this crowdsourcing for these ventilators. And as great as it is on the surface, I think there's a lot more to it that you know, can be pulled apart with some of this stuff. So So that's one thing, but I mean, and also too, there's the idea of distributed manufacturing. So if everyone has their little 3D printer at home, they can be making stuff and potentially not be impacted by, say shipping or things like that are kind of getting jammed up as of COVID. Supply chain stuff, yeah. So that's a whole other thing, but not to drone on too long. And then the first part of the question, in terms of the maker movement and seeing an opportunity for higher education through a porous approach to collaborative education, yeah, I think that's definitely like a very, like you were saying, Ricardo, it's a very fruitful application of this, because it can be this like everyday thing that, people are doing, and they're probably doing it already, and just basically broadening the idea of what counts as like making and these hands-on practices that people are doing to learn about things. So I think it's definitely, it could be something even to look into further, because it'd be quite rich.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. I'm quite conscious of time. Nancy, I see you're there, but I believe Robyn and myself will now chair and also cross over to our own presentation, and we'll see if we have some time at the end to maybe revisit some of these questions. But that was a great presentation. Thank you. Robyn, are you there? I'm
Thank you.
going to share my screen. And let's see how this works for me. Is that coming up, Robyn?
Yep.
Yep.
Great. We'll start. So someone will have to do time for us because we will be presenting. So maybe that can be you, Kit. But we will we'll start with this because I think the topic of our paper and our research is quite different from, say, the paper before, and its relationship in this conference itself is also something that we'll elaborate on. The paper is about an emerging curriculum that we've been working on at RMIT School of Fashion and Textiles. The research is called Any Other Fashion System, Changing Fashion Design Knowledges and Beliefs in Australia. And we'll elaborate on its connection to networks of knowledges and also different disciplinary networks across this paper. We show an image here of a 1930s fashion display from Melbourne College of Domestic Economy, later known as Emily Macpherson, that amalgamated to form RMIT in 1979. And our research is framed around curriculum design in a complex set of networks. And within the scope of this paper, that's what we'll really touch on. We'll also touch on a few theoretical frames to contextualize this and a commingling of various epistemologies. Fundamentally, we have found the work of philosopher and feminist Rosie Braidotti and her framework of critical posthumanities enables a grounding of some of the strategies we've used in our curriculum design that really challenge some knowledge systems, particularly related to place and also the feminist perspective of situated knowledges, and exploring the domains of what we're finding ourselves in as a potentially post-disciplinary fashion context. Place in various situated and geopolitical guises, we argue, is an essential part of curriculum design. And we'll sketch a lineage of place and discipline throughout this presentation in broader contexts of networks, but also how fashion design has often been subordinate to other design disciplines. It's aligned to various fields. It's sought various forms of legitimization. It's being categorized in different knowledge systems, as part of design sometimes, as part of art schools sometimes. And in 2020, in the School of Fashion Textiles, we've actually been formally recognised as a STEM-aligned discipline. So the discipline itself represents many different relationships to a very geopolitical sense of place. We'll also discuss this around the varied gendered personae in the discipline itself, manifest in high female identifying student enrolment numbers, but complemented also with workplace metrics. As mentioned, we started the process of reimagining a variety of fashion design programs and curriculums in 2018, and we recognise that this is unfinished business. This is ongoing process. The curriculum doesn't just start an end. It is itself a network that keeps on progressing and transgressing as we move along. We've found that we've aimed to contribute to scholarship around transforming fashion education, touching on decolonial contexts and curriculum for inclusion and diversity by scholars such as Ben Barry, as well as shifting of fashion education from design to advocacy of social change. And our research is really reflecting on this, and in the scope of this paper, we're really reflecting and seeking to analyse some of these kind of frameworks that are prevalent in the curriculum that we've been working through, and how that has been evolving in relation to fashion systems such as industry contexts, place, and the discipline itself. We also have, as mentioned, been examining this notion of post-humanities as another lens and sub-umbrella category to apply to the discipline of fashion. We have also been examining critical pedagogies from the very acclaimed and famous feminist and activist Bell Hooks, as encompassing all the areas that address bias, that inform ways of teaching and knowing, so that it has been part of the way that we've approached the fashion curriculum in general, and also the critical post-humanities framework of really questioning epistemological nature of the discipline. And an example of that is really thinking of wider clothing and dress practices, and not just thinking of the very glamorous European fashion system that most people are familiar with, but broadening that framework and thinking of post-disciplinary fashion. We also have within that really sort of looked at different aspects of place, different aspects of where we are finding the discipline, and the different ways of aligning the discipline in contributing to various aspects of it. So we also have examined this notion of place in relation to geography, in relation to public spaces, and in relation to other aspects of the distinct identity that relates to a place and relates to knowledge systems, and this notion of situated knowledges. This is a quote from the geographer Edward Ralph around that, and I'll just read the last part, that place, the paradox of place, distinctiveness is defined by reference to sameness. Place is a figure against a background of placelessness. The two are inseparable. So we really associate curriculums having a very complex relationship with that, and also to the feminist politics of space and situated knowledges, very famous by Donna Haraway, and one's location of in terms of both space, geopolitical and ecological, and time and history, as a framework for how we are working through some of this. And we also, I think, have, in recognising that, we've been looking at this notion of our place and the integration of Indigenous ontologies into a discipline. This is a quote from Charlotte Bedford, who is a First Nations fashion design student from UTS, who wrote an article as part of a cadetship for the fashion journal Fashion Theory around the meaningful integration of Indigenous ontologies and epistemologies in fashion schools as an important step in decolonising a space that has so often engaged in Indigenous design with an ever-present ethnographic gaze. We also include here, in relation to the emergence of and the formalising of the First Nations fashion design industry, which has been a very formalised industry practice that was set up in 2020 as a national voice in representing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander members. It's a very seminal moment, because this is one of the first formalised milieus of practice for First Nation fashion design artists and designers in Australia that has happened. And this is also against a backdrop of much more European formalised practices that have really implicated and influenced curriculum previously. And over to you, Robyn.
Thanks, Ricarda. Following on from Ricarda in terms of looking at the homogeny of the distinctly European fashion system that's had its influence on education as part of what our curriculum has been, and the challenge for what it might be. In doing so, we're looking at the more complex ecosystem of industry and acknowledging how education is part of this. Interesting enough, this is the first major report, the Ernst & Young report on the Australian fashion industry, is the first report that actually captures this industry. And this came out earlier this year, which acknowledges the complexities of Australia's fashion industry rather than continually referencing industry models from Europe or from other countries. So we can see the system can be understood as being much broader than designer fashion and famous European brands. And education is an important part of this. The actual circles here are proportionate. So you can see the role education plays in terms of what's happening in Australia. And these are the complexities that need to be addressed in our curriculum. So going back to looking at our institution in terms of place, our institutions have a geographical location, ours being placed in Melbourne on Kulin country. However, fashion knowledges emanate from other real and geopolitical areas. The origins of our programs and courses, as Ricarda mentioned earlier, are from the Emily McPherson College of Domestic Economy. Fashion design, as Ricarda alluded to earlier, has been classified as various things. As it emerges a major economy, it is derived from the embodied and feminized craft practices of dressmaking. Dressmaking origins of our fashion design knowledges and domestic economies are clearly shown here in this handcraft display from Emily McPherson, referencing our European historic models in terms of how you learnt about fashion, and also, of course, our head of dressmaking wearing an amazing fur coat, walking down the steps of the State Library, and then, of course, the needlework class held outdoors. So thinking about when we start to think differently about knowledge systems, next slide, please, Ricarda, we can see here the juxtaposition of looking at the State Library of Victoria, which houses the Western knowledge frameworks, juxtaposed with the hoarding artwork designed by Indigenous designer and RMIT graduate Taylor Cole, representing the knowledges found in the River Yarra, and also referencing Taylor's basket weaving, showing again something that has been passed down through her family, showing the presence of Victoria's Indigenous peoples before and after European settlement. The work also reminds us of the land beneath the State Library. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land, and the possibilities of sharing knowledges and what this might be. Next slide, please. So here also is starting to think about, the Indigenous, thinking about the situated knowledges and being on country. So this is a slide showing the census date from 2016, giving an Indigenous population of Australia from 1971 to 2011. Is also likely that the next 2016 census will also show an increase of similarly around 20%. But prior to these increases, we should point out that the number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders was estimated at more than 770,000 at the time of invasion in 1788 and subsequent genocide. It fell to around 117,000 people in 900, and a decrease by 84%. If we go to the next slide, we can see here in terms of the European diaspora, in terms of the impact again on Australia, and also looking in the context of Emily McPherson. Again, the idea that the head of dressmaking travelled to the US, the UK to learn about European knowledges to be taught at Emily McPherson, and also that the origins of the founding staff of RMIT came from many European countries, and also establishments such as Jean Patou in Paris. You can see also that we're starting to see a shift also of Asia Pacific when we go to later information about people coming to Australia. So if we go to the next slide, I'm conscious of time here. Whilst Ronald Barthes' 1967 fashion system is well known and engaged with scholarship as a structural modelling of fashion, it can be also understood as a symbiotic tool that reveals a network of signification and resignification. There have been radical changes in the places of the fashion system, becoming a global place. Anthropologist Giuliana Mencieri describes this in reference to prestigious fashion capitals such as Paris as the following. The fashion system transformed into a global industry or global system defined as a political and historical global economy. Fashion workers accumulate the greatest symbolic capital in Paris, but are paid the least. So here you can start to see a ranking from through Valerie Steele's book in terms of the ranking of fashion cities, which is very influential in terms of how our students view sometimes the world and how fashion is viewed. Melbourne does rank at 24 and Sydney is 40. We thought we better mention that one. Next slide, please. So within this context of these complex networks of knowledges, we needed to address as well the categorization of fashion design as a discipline. The gendered nature of the field becomes apparent. The origins of fashion design as an industry are from localized and embodied craft practices of dressmaking. Fashion design established under the guise of haute couture is attributed to Charles Frederick Worth, shown here in the first portrait from 1895, dressed in the style of the successful artiste Rembrandt. Worth is described as the father of fashion. His legacy is attributed to legitimacy of practice with several regulating industry bodies that set rules for how practice should happen. Outside of that practice, dressmaking has always happened as a sustainable and embodied informal trade and craft by women. Shown here on the far right is final year student, the Diploma of Needlecraft of Emily McPherson in 1858, wearing the debutante dress she made while she studied at Emily McPherson. Very much it was about making your own clothes. It was lots of presentations of women with the outcomes of their successful classes, while a celebration of, we can see here, calling out Chris Armstrong, who was the first male to graduate from the Diploma of Fashion Design and Production, had a lot of publicity because this was seen as a milestone for the success of the discipline by having a male graduate. So it's also important to point out that as the discipline was accepted into this sort of serious side, it became aligned with business and management. And also in terms as notable as Ricarda pointed out earlier, that design and management as a field of research aligned to STEM disciplines. So you can see here the evolution of that way it has been represented. So if we go to the next slide, Ricarda. So as we look here, just to call out, and these are the sort of things that people working in the field are very used to. Alice Payne, QUT fashion scholar, makes reference to the categorization of the discipline situated in other design fields. Viewed this way, fashion design is but a naughty little sister to the more serious masculine design disciplines. She is wayward, mercurial, impossible to contain, and her products come in 150 billion forms produced year after year. Despite the fact that all bodies require clothes, fashion design retains a perception as being most feminine of all the design disciplines. Fashion itself is highly gendered, whether it's in its modes of production, both creative and technical labour, or in its consumption.
In a comparable survey in the UK, and in reference to this, we can see that the Australian fashion and textile industry contributes more than 27.2 billion to Australia's economy, generating 7.2 billion in export years, but particularly that 77% of those surveyed identify as female in an Ernst & Young industry report from 2021. In a comparative survey in the UK called Shattering the Glass Runway from McKinsey & Company, we can also see reference to gender inequalities in high executive or creative director roles of women's wear fashion brands, with 14% of these brands being only run by females. in our ecosystem of schools, these gender polemics play out. Our enrolments have always been dominated by female identifying students. Currently, we have 86% of these female identifying students, and this has been steadily decreasing recently over the last 4 years, but is a very real context of the industry that we align our knowledge system to. In returning to Bradotti and critical posthuman frameworks, we can identify in design curriculum now that the post-disciplinary in fashion therefore exist in critical and creative in equal parts. But really fundamental to this is class, race, gender and sexual orientation, age and able-bodiedness as continuing to function as significant markers in framing and policing access to humanities in reference to this way of framing post-critical humanities. Over to you, Robyn.
We're going to speed quite quickly now because I'm conscious of the time. Just putting up in terms of grappling with complex networks of situated knowledges and designing our new curriculum. We did ask our 2020 Bachelor of Fashion Design Honours graduates to think about how they would describe themselves. And again, you can study this yourself, but we've got, you know, roles like serial pattern clasher, extreme wear designer, character costumier, craft preservationist. It starts to show you again the possibilities and again the shifts that have occurred as we start to rethink our curricula. If we go to the next slide, just got 2 slides to go, and just looking at the areas that we started to start to put together and thinking of this emerging fashion curricula. We've called out many of those, so I'm not going to go over those again, but I would like to say it also in terms of the challenges faced with COVID-19 has actually heightened many of these and actually given us a way forward in thinking in terms of a lot of those objectives that perhaps were accelerated because of COVID-19 rather than the other way around. And if we just go to the last concluding slide, Ricarda.
Yeah, thanks, Robyn. And I think it's also because we've been addressing the very complex network systems that are aligned to education and a discipline. And the links between fashion industries and industries in general and education as geopolitical places and symbolic places and the localities where practice happens in those milieus. Also the way that gender and the way the discipline has been gendered, the gender inequalities that are still pertinent. And reconciling these divergent places in fashion education has been part of the work that we've undertaken and also part of how we've been able to sustain, I think, the curriculum through a very disruptive time. And it really also, within it, relates to many other things that Robyn alluded to just before, but pertinent to all of this, I think, is the way that this curriculum references many complicated networks and many complicated systems of practice as well. So that concludes our presentation. I might just stop sharing my screen. I don't think I've done that, no. Still sharing? Yeah. Okay, great.
Thank you so much, Ricarda. And to help with sharing momentarily before I step back to mode, phenomenal presentation. There are some questions coming through in the chat there. Perhaps we'll ignore my one, but Denise, sorry. Refreshing to see the Australian specific local data, really textile, fashion ecosystem and economy. Complex ideas for moving forward. Yes, I wondered if you could comment. We've noticed in art, music, theatre, COVID generating incredible, and they've been called transmutations of practice in COVID, how those things meet the screen, for example. Have you seen even further developments in fashion over the last 18 months?
Oh, 100%. So we haven't really, in the space of what we discussed today, we haven't really been able to talk about some of the nuances of this curriculum that's in response to these frameworks that we've kind of identified. But they sit really well within it. So the notion of challenging fashion practice and wider notions of making practice has been part of the curriculum and honestly enhanced by COVID-19. It has been a real thing that actually pushed the curriculum further. it enabled pedagogies we would never dream of or would be too naive to try. And the whole kind of digital uptake and upskill of the whole, I think, both students and staff in how we work has really changed. But that was already within our notions of how we were approaching this kind of post-disciplinary space. So it was enabled in the curriculum, but I think the pedagogies and the learning experiences pushed it to that place. So, yeah.
I'm just going to add one thing to relate to Denise as well. The other thing that happened is that we were seen as part of industry. So we actually had the fashion industry coming to us to talk to us about stuff. It also was seminal that we actually got industry included in the Ernst & Young report. I actually had to work quite hard to make sure that, because we're never seen as part of industry. So for us, going back to building curriculum and being part of an industry and the learnings, and also you learn all the time, the sort of, again, the sharing of knowledge, it was very important to have the industry piece. So that's why that report will stand out, because you will not find any other report that actually has education in that way. So I think that's also was a significant thing, and that's why I wanted to call that out, because it is an exciting moment to actually see that. So I'm pleased you picked that up.
Oh, it absolutely is. Honestly, it excites me, and also because it's not sort of a functional situation. It just expands all your other amazing conceptual practices and the things that you're doing with curricula. I honestly, I am wildly excited in a way that I did not expect to be. So there you go. Amazing. Amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think it's, you know, it is very much so emerging research and practice research through actually doing this. So I will point that out, that the theoretical frameworks have come after trying to make sense of what this is, and also how this might be applicable to other disciplines and other areas as well. So thank you.
Wonderful.
I wonder if we need to move on, and I will switch back from presenter to chair. So I wonder, Nancy, if you're ready and able to present.
Yes.
Now.
Hi. Yes.
Hi.
I managed to do a lot of background processes there. Thank you.
Okay, I'll stop
collaborating.
My camera. Great. Over to you, Nancy. Whenever you're ready.
Thank you. I'll just, I'm collaborating. Thank you, Kit. Full screen, please.
And if it's okay, I've realised full screen won't let me run both systems at the same time.
All right. As well, whatever. Thank you. Thanks for helping. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm presenting on country of the Muwinina people in Nipaluna, Hobart, Lutruwita, Tasmania, and I'm paying my respects to the Aboriginal community elders, past, present and emerging, whose custodianship has endured since the first sunrise, where trade and ceremony have connected kin since time immemorial. Change slide, please. So we often hear, and double click, thanks. So we often hear of artists and designers encouraging care and sustainability, but rarely do we acquire the tools to practice how this might occur in a day-to-day basis in our pedagogy. So by scrutinising how digital web server infrastructure is normalised based on imperial conventions and knowledge systems, in this presentation I'm describing alternative and counter perspectives in online pedagogy that moves towards embodying the internet as a more situated ecology, while designing for minimal and expressive communication. So last semester I led Next Nature Networks, a studio exploring a set of critical media practices to digital design students and artistic researchers to foster an understanding of programming as an aesthetic which extends beyond utility. So I suggest the modes, or these modes that I'll be discussing, open an interesting space for collaborative networks, and I describe some of the issues and opportunities they raise. So these pedagogical sites are contested locations of rich agonistic debate, as we shall hear. Change of slide, please. So focusing on tacit hands-on computational methods from the frontiers of feminist digital literacy, and counterculture web server communities demonstrate ways that contribute to the restoration of diverse spaces of sociability and kinship. Change slide, please. In this studio, we focused on the materiality of plain text computing. These tasks often required a personal, creative foray and use of technical practices that are slow and demanding. Change slide, please. Double click if you can, if you can play the video. Thanks. The first step was to install an Internet Relay Chat. IRC is the acronym. This there's many different clients that students could choose from. And IRC servers are connected together in a network located all over the world, and each server is connected to several others, but not all directly connected to one another. And in IRC, a message is transferred from one server to another under a spanning tree server architecture, meaning that the message that someone sends always takes the shortest route through the network to reach its final destination. So it uses less processing power and less carbon footprint, among other things. IRC can run commands into the chat, which is, you're seeing some of these documents here, some of our studios. So in order to take part in the text-based class, students needed to use IRC, and we would also use the terminals to create files and folders straight from the command line, which can reveal glitches and issues that in turn increase our awareness of the systems that we use each day and often largely ignore. One of the student feedback was, I quote, IRC chat was an ecology of timestamps and invisibility, muted and therefore spacious. There was room to imagine and swoop around with that one suture to the group of time-stamped texts and beautiful typos. We used, there were a lot of typos, and we also related that to leet speak, which is a computer subculture in itself. It's an informal language or code used on the internet in which standard letters are often replaced by numerals or special characters that resemble the letters in appearance. Leet speak is also a form of cipher or transforming a message to conceal a meaning. You see that a lot in pop stars these days, changing their letters to numbers, but this is coming from computer subculture. So nowadays it's taken for granted from popular internet culture and also academic literature that any social groups operating via computer-mediated communication systems can be referred to as a community. And Howard Rheingold's early 90s prophetic work on the concept of virtual communities discusses this. Please change slide. So thinking about infrastructure as ecology, being considerate about the channels that we use to communicate, and we can negotiate our online dependencies, or we could and we can. And this studio is also hosted, self-hosted on my own web server infrastructure, which allowed us a lot more possibilities to explore the network. So the students were also in diverse time zones and cultural contexts, and we use this as a guide to this particular tool here as a guide to thinking about the carbon footprint of the internet, working with emergent digital technologies in a critical way. Please change the slide. So the findings that I'm showing are from our sessions reveal that these utterly different relationships between teaching and students, often understood these days in business terms of providers and clients, deliberately, slowing one's internet reduces the capacity for data collection to speed along in the background, and is a way of enacting another way of being with alterities, among other things. But what also these platforms offered was a reverse engineered glimpse of students of a counter technology, of counter inscription, and also counter intelligence. And we also looked at user experience, or UX, as well, the idea that we get to know what the user wants, needs, and provide it, which so often assumes that there's one type of homogenized user and that what they want is a product to meet their needs and will thus be delivered. But instead, UX was understood to be a microcosm of the frictionless architecture or infrastructure that we're often given and don't question. So discussing this and these notions, we replaced UX with the framework of dramaturgy. Please change slide, thanks. So exploring command line computing, and plain text computing, or the materialities of text, video, thanks. We then used a terminal to create simple text files. So starting with the social cultural history of command line interface, we explored the materiality of plain text in a computer terminal and discovered the wide range of command line tools that were available. These small programs can be chained together into pipelines capable of processing any type of data or text, and they're a way of quickly producing unique and custom tool sets, providing a wide range of creative opportunities. Please change slide, and it's a video, thanks. So the command line is a textual interface for the computer, which you're looking at here. So rather than being an old-fashioned interface, it is a completely different methodological approach to computing. Here we're seeing top, which is showing the processes that run underneath the graphical user interface. So you're understanding the consumption of your computer processor. So instead of large visual programs aimed at being professional tools and products, command line tools follow the philosophy of doing one process and doing it well. Please change the slide, thanks. So we also used, along with the command line interface, an Etherpad, which is what you're seeing here. And the activities were collated on the studio's Etherpads. And an Etherpad is a collaborative writing tool to take notes, coordinate, document gatherings that happen in and around the studio. So Etherpad had process instructional content and is a low bandwidth, subjective temporal solution. Please change slide. And it enabled the students as a collective to give feedback, to modify and update content, and it presents a framework of open collaboration in a work in progress towards reshaping and rethinking in unstable times. Please change slide. So eventually students engaged with a variety of instruction sets that became a site of discussion and experimentation, coupled with collaborative writing, code, performance, installation, programming, appropriation of cut-ups and dialogue as outlined in the assignment descriptions. Please change slide. So as well as engaging with the conceptual issues being raised in the weekly readings and discussions, what you're seeing here is from our second week, where one of the main questions in the studio was posed to a text called Making Kin with Machines by Jason Lewis and collaborators, which asked, with the advancement in language technologies, why is 90% of all computing done in English still? Is this changing? Why can't we write code in our ancestral languages? Which is a huge discussion that I can't fully go into in this presentation, but these are the type of things that we were considering with our relationships to systems and networks, procedures, and listening to other possible voices and alterities. Another area we broached was computational poetics. So in everyday, please change the slide. In everyday writing and speech, language itself is barely noticeable. So simple marks on a page disappear right before your eyes as we read. And through its own supremacy and ubiquity, language is elusive and often difficult to perceive. The words pass over our eyes like stealthy cryptograms, fleeting messages talking back to us. It is here that poetry intervened, and poetry is language speaking itself. And this is actually no different with computer code. Please change slide. So code is the language used to communicate, and this is a video, thanks. Used to communicate with computers. It has its own rules, syntax and meaning and semantics. And like dancers and artists, writers or poets, coders also have their own style that includes strategies for optimizing the code being read by a computer, facilitating its understanding through visual organization, comments for other coders. So it is a form of choreography. Code can speak literature, logic and maths, and it contains different layers of abstraction that links them to the physical worlds of processors and memory chips. Please change slide. So this task that I'm showing next is a response to the notion of a computational poetics or code poems written in software language of the student's choice. So as long as it could run or compile on a computer, and it could only have the maximum size of 5 kilobytes, which was a very, just even going into the whole detail of file sizes was interesting to see how far we have come, or how much we consume as people that use, a lot of people that use computers. So as you can see, these minimal rules, each student was free to interpret the idea of what code poetry might be, to compile, and I will show you a cross compilation of these poetic attempts which you're looking at now. And please change slide. So
Nancy, if we can begin to conclude shortly. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no worries.
We can begin.
Collection reveals the inner workings and the elements of a particular software and its authors. And please change the slide. The performance of poetic computation reveals different things, obviously, about how the students are learning, and some seem to talk back to the code itself, challenging its expressivity and potential as poetry. So others would looked at world events and topical themes emerged, as bug testing does, and those of us used to reading through code snippets often barely notice its structure, but the simple satisfaction encapsulated by an I or a comma, for instance. And please change slides. Software bugs can impact the functioning and safety and security of the system. It actually all began with a bug that was actually on a frame, so on a fan. So it's a very situated history as well, which sometimes we tend to forget. Please change slides. So just to conclude, when things get truly complex, as they are indeed getting, and please change slide, the distinction between us, our tools, and the things that can be made, please change slide twice and then put the video on. Thank you. Next one, next slide. Thank you so much. So yeah, just to conclude, when things get truly complex, as they are indeed getting, the distinction between us, our tools, and the things that can be made with them begins to dissolve, and the information scapes which we navigate daily are filled with media that are intertwined with abundance of messages and identity. And so in a bid to decenter the human as the locus of action, which we're also trying to do in this studio, reveals the acute need to conceive computing practices as dynamic forms and processes, and to acknowledge the elements that form the assemblages of networks and systems that perform around and act through us. So processes like these not only delegitimate authorial authority, but compost knowledge production. So with that said, thank you very much. And I look forward to talking to everyone more. But basically, you know, the hope is that studios like this are drawing on emerging technological systems that are social and cultural constructs in palpable ways, and reimagining the networks and systems in which we are living within, and indicates the intention of being an individual and a collective, and addresses the ability to capture the process as it unfurled, which is a testament to ways in which a visceral comprehension of remote presence through networked infrastructure can be engaged with. Thank you very much.
Fantastic presentation, Nancy. Thank you. I think there's already some comments, and please, for anyone, if anyone has a comment for Nancy, please pop it in the chat. Already there's comments around the performance of poetic computation and this generative space. I was just immersed in what you were showing. So seeing the way that you've found this different, I think, response to computational systems is super fascinating. Could you talk any more about how, after this iteration, what would be the next iteration of this studio?
Yeah, I'm working on a studio, hopefully, which is just more direct, and so it's going to be called Choreography and Computational Code. So to manage expectations a bit more. Yeah.
And will there ever be any kind of, will there be translation of this coding and these scripts in different mediums? I was just thinking through that, like as real life performances, as coding for a scripting of performance.
Absolutely. There's those possibilities for sure.
Yeah, that was fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, so there is the potential to actually do these in print ways or in live performances as mise en scène or scenographies. And I'm actually coming from a background in performing arts, so that's probably why the link's so easy for me to make. But I often don't.
And I think Kit has a comment, and maybe Kit will elaborate because Kit's hands up as well. Hi, Kit.
Thanks for doing the slides, Kit.
Not at all. And it seemed perfect, genuinely, for the presentation to have a sort of strange distributed network of communication to present.
showing the bones.
I just wondered about the glitch, the bug, this metaphor that's running through it. Do you believe in the glitch, Nancy?
Oh gosh, it's a whole area. Like there's Glitch Feminism, the book that has just come out. I don't know if you've been aware of that, but also my very good friend and colleague Rosa Menkman has written on the glitch, and I highly recommend her work. And I do believe in the glitch, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's obviously the glitch that is in the filter glitch, and there's amazing frameworks of theories in regards to error and errors opening up possibility, and these spaces of possibility are really important, because otherwise if we ignore the errors and the glitches and shove them under the carpet, then there's no room for discussion. And that's, I think, the hardest thing to do, but the most important thing to do at the moment is to, well, as Haraway says, stay with the trouble and sit that being uncomfortable with the fact that we are working with these extra technologies of extraction. They have been mined from mainly, a lot of unceded lands and these minerals, and that are allowing us to communicate today is also, is also troubled. Yeah. So if that's how I connect to the glitch. Humans are a glitch. Yeah. Some people say. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
Are there any other questions for Nancy? I'm conscious of time, and I believe we will have to shortly conclude this session. The next session, Kit, starts at 12:45. Am I right? Yes. So there will be enough time to run. There is a comment here about just thanking you for the poetics and inserting the poetics into these prevailing structures. I just think it's so fabulous that students get to experience this. So that's a wonderful.
And I also want to say it doesn't go without issues. Yeah, and there's.
I understand.
That I glitched. Well, I actually wanted to share that glitch, but yeah, it's certainly, yeah. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for your great papers.
Yeah, thank you also. Thank you everyone, and thank you also for coming. We can start to probably close this session unless there's any more questions. Thank you also to Matthew. Thank you to Robyn as well, and thanks for this wonderful session and this fantastic conference. I have to say about this very engaging discussion. So thank you, everyone. I will now close the session and see you all shortly. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much. Wonderful.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. See you.